Hello, thank you for being here in this moment. I don't know where you're listening to this story, on your way to work, in the quiet of your own room, or in the middle of a long, busy day. But if you've clicked to listen, then perhaps your heart is also searching for something, a truth, a reminder, something that makes you feel like you belong in a bigger picture. Today, I am not telling you a fantasy story. It's a very real journey, a journey that maybe you are a part of. Relax, open your heart, and let each story lead you back to something you may have known, but forgotten for a long time. Have you ever had the feeling that something in history was intentionally hidden? Part of the truth is not in what you learned in school, nor does it appear on the radio or television. Something deeper, reaching to the very roots of humanity, of identity, of memory, of origin. This is not the story of an old book. It's about a reminder, buried for hundreds of years, and now emerging strongly in the hearts of millions of people around the world. Today, we will embark on a journey together to discover one of the most shocking secrets in religious history. Why Book of Jubilees, the Jubilee book, is banned, removed from the Bible, and what is in it that makes the whole world so afraid. This is a story that is not just for hearing, it's to feel, to look back at myself, and maybe to start a return journey. Have you ever wondered if there is something in history that people don't want us to know about? There are books that were once respected, like the Genesis or Exodus, but then suddenly disappeared. Not because it's wrong, but because it's so true. A truth so glaring that those in power were forced to hide it. And the book we're talking about today is that Book of Jubilees, Jubilee book. This is not just an ancient text. It is a powerful reminder of identity, of roots, and of a forgotten people, the true Israelites. Maybe you've never heard of it, and you're not the only one. For hundreds of years, this book was excluded from the official Bible, stamped unofficial, and then gradually fell into silence. But you know what? Behind that silence is not oblivion. That's the arrangement, a strategy, a sophisticated control. Because if someone really reads and understands this book, they will realize one thing. The true identity of God's people is not as we are taught. Instead of the familiar images from movies and paintings, white characters, auburn hair, blue eyes, Book of Jubilees tells about a people with dark skin, living scattered throughout Africa, America, and remote islands. A people who once observed the Sabbath quietly were forced to change their names, forgot their mother tongue, and lived under layers of oppression, but still kept one thing: the deep memory that they belong to something greater. They are not just Africans, not just slaves or immigrants, as the world labels them. They are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people who receive promises from God. And that's why this book was banned. Because if this truth is exposed, a huge structure, from doctrine to politics, will be shaken. And those who once controlled information will no longer be able to continue telling stories the way they want. Imagine, you live your whole life believing that you are just a small, weak, worthless part. But then, one day, you find a piece of the puzzle, a book, and in it you read that your people, you are the chosen people. He is the bearer of God's covenant, a person whose name was written in the most sacred stories. How will you feel? Shock, surprised. Then a strong feeling arose. I have meaning. I am not as anonymous as I thought. That's the thing Book of Jubilees bring. Not rebellion, not division, but restoration of memory, of dignity, of truth. When we understand that it is possible that our ancestors were not just enslaved people, but people who were promised blessings from God, everything changes. The way we see ourselves, the way we raise our children, The way we move through this life, it's all different. Do you see? That's why people had to ban that book, because when a person realizes their true value, they are no longer easily controlled. They no longer believe everything people say. They started asking questions, and they began to live as a free people. But there is one great consolation. The truth, no matter how long it is buried, always knows how to return. It doesn't require miracles, just need the heart to desire enough. And today, if you are listening to this story, perhaps your heart is also awakening. That book, Book of Jubilees, may have been banned, but its words are still echoing in the hearts of millions of people around the world. And once again, the question arises, if the truth has been hidden, then what happens when we decide to look directly at it? Are you ready? Do you remember in the previous section we touched on something really important? The truth never disappears. It's just hidden. But there will come a time when that truth emerges on its own, like light filtering through every crack in the darkness. And in this case, that light came from a book, Book of Jubilees. So, what makes an ancient book, written thousands of years ago, become a threat to the entire system of power, from the church to the government? Why are they so afraid of it that they have to exclude it from the official Bible, ban it, bury it in silence? The answer does not lie in the pages of old books. It lies in the truth that the book dares to speak frankly. Jubilees does not write vaguely. It does not use figurative language to caress the reader's emotions. It is written very clearly about the times, lineages, places, and laws that the Lord gave to his people. Not vaguely for the whole world, but for a specific people, a select group of people, a real bloodline. That is very different from how, centuries later, religious institutions tried to make the Bible story universal. That is, for all peoples, all nations, all skin colors, all creeds, as a way to erase the true identity of God's people. Book of Jubilees refused to do it. It does not say, everyone is Israel. It said, who is this? And that, you see, shakes the very foundations of modern theology. Imagine living in a system of doctrine all your life where every image of a Bible character, from Abraham to Moses to Jesus, is depicted with white skin, light brown hair, and blue eyes. Then suddenly, a book appears, revealing that they actually have completely different appearances. They come from African lands, have dark skin, and live in a culture very different from what the West has painted. It wasn't just a shock. It is a subversion of the mind. Jubilees doesn't stop at race or ethnicity. It goes further, to the rules of living, the holy days, and the sacred calendar that God established in the beginning. Did you know, in this book, the Sabbath is not Sunday, as most Christians currently observe, but from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, as ancient Jewish tradition kept. It also does not recognize holidays such as Christmas or Easter, which were added later by the Roman Empire. Instead, it emphasizes the actual feasts appointed by God, such as Passover, Pentecost, Atonement, etc. And the calendar in Jubilees is also very different. Not the 365-day Gregorian calendar like we use, but a 364-day calendar based on the order of the sun, moon, and stars, exactly the way God created the world according to Genesis. These may seem like minor differences in culture or tradition, but in fact, they overthrow an entire belief structure that millions of people have followed all their lives. And when that happens, do you know what comes with it? Fear. Not from those who are seeking the truth, but from those who control the truth. Because when the truth is revealed, control will collapse. You can feel this if you look at history. Why did the medieval church prohibit the Bible from being written in common language? Why did they only allow the Bible in Latin, a language that only the clergy understood? Because whoever controls God's word controls faith, and whoever controls beliefs controls people. Jubilees, in its own way, broke that. It is not simply a retelling of history. It reminds us that God not only blesses, He also gives laws. And that law cannot be changed just because a Roman emperor wants to make it easier to govern. This leads to an extremely vexing question. If our major holidays come not from the Bible, but from Roman pagan festivals, then who are we really worshiping? Living for what? Jubilees does not force you to respond immediately, but it lays seeds of doubt, a kind of sacred doubt that makes it impossible for you to return to the state of blind belief like before. And perhaps that is the scariest thing about the forces that control religion. Because when people begin to think, they will begin to change. And when a generation changes, they pass it on to their children. And from a small seed, a forest will sprout, where truth is called by its true name, where identity is restored, and where people no longer bow to falsehoods painted as sacred. If you're listening to this, perhaps your heart is also slightly moved. Maybe you've asked yourself, why do I always feel like something isn't right? And today, you found a piece of the puzzle, a buried book, a hidden truth. But then, like the morning light, it is returning. You see, sometimes power doesn't require violence, just one word at the right time, a reminder. You are not anonymous, you are chosen. And that's what makes it so Book of Jubilees becomes a dangerous book. And then, when we begin to understand the power of Book of Jubilees, a question naturally arises. If everything the book says is true, then what happened to the Israelites? Where did they go? Why today, the world no longer recognizes them? The answer, once again, lies in history, but not the history you learn in textbooks. It is a history of blood, tears, and slave ships quietly leaving the West African coast. Millions of Africans have been kidnapped from their homeland. They were chained up, locked in the ship's hold, living like commodities, without a name, without a homeland, without a future. They were taken to foreign lands, the Americas, the Caribbean, South America, and forced to serve as slaves for rising civilizations built on their flesh and blood. And you might think, yes, that's a great human tragedy, but what does that have to do with the Bible? What does it have to do with prophecy? It's time Book of Jubilees gives us chills, because in those ancient lines, there are prophetic passages that, if the Israelites do not obey God's law, they will be handed over to the pagans, kicked out of the promised land, enslaved, stripped of their names and identities, until they no longer remember who they are. And if you are the blood of those slaves, if you are their descendant, how can you read this without feeling your heart ache? It is no coincidence that slaves in America still kept the Sabbath secretly. They were forbidden to learn to read, but they sang ancient hymns, talking about Moses, about deliverance, about the promised land. They didn't have a map, but they had memories, and faith that one day God would bring them back, not about a geographical land, but back to myself, returning to their true identity, to their true freedom, and to the sacred covenant that their ancestors signed with God thousands of years ago. This makes us look back at the entire history of the slave trade. It's not just a crime against humanity. It could be part of a self-fulfilling prophecy, painfully and cruelly. And if so, what does that mean? It means that those who were once considered bottom of society, those who were called barbarians, uncivilized people, may be the chosen ones. The true people of Israel were exiled not because of their incompetence, but because they violated the sacred covenant. And then, as the prophecy says, they will have to go through centuries of suffering before being restored. It's not a fairy tale. It is a spiritual tragedy, and also a living hope. Because if there is one thing that prophecy always promises, it is this: the exile will not last forever. There will come a day when God's people will be called back, not just returning to the land of our ancestors, but returning to ourselves, to faith, to law, to truth. And if you pay attention, you'll see it happening. More and more people of African descent around the world are starting to ask, who am I? Where do my ancestors really come from? Why do I always feel like there's something bigger that I've never been taught? They began to study the Bible. They found Book of Jubilees. And as they read, a deep part of their hearts lit up. There was something in that book that said more about them than anything else. And you know what the magic is? They don't read it like a scholar. They read it like a child trying to remember his mother's old lullaby. They read it with their souls, with their ancestral memories, and they know, this is me. From Harlem to Haiti, from Nigeria to New York, from Brazil to Botswana. A wave of awakening is silently spreading. People who were once forced into silence are starting to speak up. Names that were once forgotten are being recalled. You see, history is not just about the past. History is living prophecy. And if what Book of Jubilees? If the writing is true, then we are not just witnesses, but can be a part of that story, the story of exile, about loss, but then about the resurgence, not by rising by sword and spear, but with awareness, by faith, and by returning to the root values that God has established, not to control people, but to restore them. And if you're listening this far, you're probably feeling it in your heart too. A gentle call, not pressing, but not silent either. It says, it's time to remember. It's time to return. Returning is not running away from the present. It's about standing firmly in the present, with a deeper memory, a clearer belief, and a true freedom, something no one can take away. Book of Jubilees, not just an ancient text. It is a mirror, and when a person looks into it, they no longer see a slave status. They saw a child who had been lost, but now, returning. If the previous parts were an eye-opening journey, looking back at the past, looking directly at the hidden truth, then now we are entering the most important thing, the return. It is not a return to a particular land or a bygone era. It's about returning to yourself. Book of Jubilees does not end in darkness. It does not let the chosen people drift forever in pain or exile. On the contrary, it predicts a time when those who were once despised, once lost their names, once called slaves, will be called by their true names, Israel. And it is not a political Israel, not a state created by global powers. They are the real Israelites, those who carry the blood of the covenant, even though they have been scattered to the four corners of the earth. Although erased from official history, they are still there, living, breathing, believing, and waiting for something that cannot be named, until they found it in a seemingly forgotten book. That rise did not begin with violence. It begins with remembrance. Remember who you are. Remember that there is one who once called you your son. Remember that your existence is not a coincidence, but part of a divine plan written from the beginning of time. When a person realizes he or she is not an outcast, but chosen, it changes everything. They started living differently. They no longer bow their heads to lies. They no longer accept inferiority as fate. They stand up, not to prove anything to the world, but to live up to the light that has been placed within them. And that's the thing Book of Jubilees aim. A recovery, not just of a people, but of a sacred memory. An identity that no one can take away. A truth that no one can hide forever. That truth is emerging. In the singing of an African child in Haiti. In a whispered prayer in the middle of the night in Harlem. in the raised eyes of a young black man reading the Bible with his heart for the first time, and within yourself. If your heart is softly ringing something, then perhaps you are also a part of that awakening. There is nothing more sacred than knowing where you belong. And Book of Jubilees, even though buried for hundreds of years, is always waiting to remind you you have never been forgotten. It's just that now you're back. Maybe after listening to this story, you won't see the world the same way again. You may ask questions that have been left unanswered about my origins, about the history of our people, about the truth that has been blurred through layers of time. Book of Jubilees is not a mythological book. It is a calling, silent but powerful, for those who have ever felt lost in this world. And if your heart at any moment feels fluttering, then maybe you're also being called back to the truth, back to the roots, back to yourself. Because the truth, no matter how long it is hidden, always finds a way to be heard. The question is, are you ready to listen?